The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar about international trade agreements and what you need to know about them in the upcoming years. My name is William Barnes-Graham and I am the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are an online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, Ask the Experts forum and our Export Action Plan tool. You can find all of these on our website at www.open2export.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's only professional membership body for international trade, offering a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A at the end of the session, and you can ask questions at any point during this webinar using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. Also, if you'd like to have the slides shared with you afterwards, please get in touch with us at admin@opentoexport.com. We have two great speakers today, covering what you need to know about trade agreements and WTO rules if you're a goods exporter will be Sandra Strong, Managing Partner at Strong & Hurd. And doing the same for service exporters will be Dr Gabriel Gari, the Senior Lecturer in International Law at Queen Mary University, London. But first off, over to you, Sandra.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So we're going to have a look at the free trade agreements for goods. Okay, would you move me on, please, William? Okay, first of all, we need to establish that there are two different types of origin in international trade. Well, there's actually lots of types, but for trade purposes, customs purposes, you look at origin to establish the nationality of the goods, and that is called non-preference origin. It's used by customs authorities for lots of different measures, and that isn't the one we're going to concentrate on today. Just to say, non-preference origin is where you issue certificates of origin granted through the Chambers of Commerce, and you make declarations on your invoices to confirm whether the goods are made in the UK, in Germany, in the US, in China. The origin we're looking at today is called preferential origin, which is linked directly to preferential and free trade agreements. Now, free trade agreements cover lots of different things. They've changed a lot over the years, and Gabrielle will be looking at the services side of that. So I'm just going to run through what you expect to see in a free trade agreement for movement of goods. Now, most of the free trade agreements that we currently have in the EU, they're still valid in the UK. We've not left the EU yet, so everything is still up and running as before. And most of those agreements are what are called bilateral agreements. That means that it applies to you as an exporter, to the other countries within the agreement, and an importer from those countries as well. But we're mainly going to look at this as an export activity at the moment. As you know, with the UK leaving the EU, there's been a lot of talk about having our own free trade agreements. So the time really is pressing to make sure that companies have all the information available so that you can take advantage of the current EU agreements now, but be ready and prepared for additional agreements that may come in post-Brexit. One of the key things about the free trade agreements are their individual agreements. So the EU has 28 countries, has an agreement either with another group of countries or with individual countries, such as EU South Korea, EU Chile, EU Mexico, etc. Every one of those agreements have been negotiated individually, and although the EU have preferred terms, they do differ. So when we're talking about working under free trade agreements, you must have access to the terms of each agreement, because how your goods meet the terms of these agreements may actually have to differ. And the three main agreements that we tend to look at for guidance here is Mexico, who very much wrote their own terms for goods. We also have the standard EU type of agreements, which you can see with Switzerland, and then South Korea, where the agreements that were actually put in place for goods is actually a bit more flexible. So some companies can meet those rules of origin, while they might not meet some of the others. It isn't an easy thing to grasp, but you have to be aware of how your goods are coded for customs. So on this slide under the preferential origin, it mentions HS code. You might know that as the tariff number or the commodity code number, but if you don't have that number right, you cannot read the free trade agreement correctly and know what your particular rule is for preferential origin. Okay, William. Right, so what's our initial steps? Well, first of all, we need to know which countries are involved. So if we are exporting or looking to export from the UK to South Korea or South Africa, Norway, Switzerland, the first thing to do is to see if there is a free trade agreement in place. Especially when importing into the EU, there may be more than one trade agreement that covers that market. But we will stick to the simple one that we will look at free trade agreements, and it's an EU bilateral agreement with, for example, South Korea. So the next step is, what is the tariff code that we're going to ship? Then, because there is a lot of admin involved in preparing and also monitoring how free trade agreements work, so making sure you've got the right procedures and processes in place, find out how much money will actually be saved. And this is the key thing about preferential trade agreements when we're dealing with goods. It's all about saving money. So there is a website, the Market Access Database, which will be on the next slide, but we'll just wait for a moment before looking at that. The Market Access Database allows you to access the tariff pages of nearly every country in the world. This is a completely free service run by the European Commission. You select the tariff page and go there and see if there is a difference between what's called MFN rate of duty, most favoured nation, which really is the standard rate, and is there an EU rate. Now, if the standard rate is already zero, why are you looking at a free trade agreement? Because you can't get better than nothing as a duty rate. So you might find that your goods naturally have zero access to that market, in which case all the work you put into a free trade agreement will be unnecessary. But if there is a positive duty rate, and a lot of goods into South Korea, for example, incur 8% duty, the free trade agreement will make that zero in most cases. Sometimes free trade agreements reduce the duty, but very often the EU go for zero duty. So you have a look, you see that your goods will actually cost your customer 8% less if you can issue the free trade agreement form or statement. But that isn't the end of it. You don't just issue the form, you now have to know, do your goods qualify? And you can only do that by reading the terms of the agreement. So we'll just have a look at the Market Access Database page here. Okay, this is an example of Chile, and you'll notice that there are three columns on the, well, looking at the screen at the right-hand side. EU duty rate, all showing as zero. MFN, most favoured nation, the best rate available when there isn't any free trade agreement, 6%. And then next to that, the Market Access Database gives you a link to the rule of origin. So you can click on that and it will give you a summary of what process your goods have had to have gone through to qualify within this particular trade agreement. Now, it is a shortcut, so being a little bit cautious when it comes to laws and regulations, I would recommend that although you take that as an initial guide, you always go back to the agreements and read them. So we move on to the next slide. It's all about reading the articles of the Free Trade Agreement. Now, if some of you are thinking, blimey, this is a lot of work, just remember, free trade agreements are not mandatory. Nobody has to use them. It's all about money. So if you find that the cost of administering free trade agreements is excessive, then you don't have to use them, but then you have customers who might say, well, if we buy from Germany, they will give us the forms. And if we buy from you, we've got 8%, 6%, 11% duty. So it has to be a commercial decision, and if you decide to go along with using free trade agreements, you must be compliant. So each free trade agreement tends to be called a protocol, and within it they have the general articles, and they have what has these specific rules for each chapter of the tariff called the list rules. Don't just look at the list rules, because you have to know what other terms are applicable to trading under this FTA with the other market. Okay. The list rules are the ones that are negotiated, and it takes a long time to negotiate free trade agreements because you have countries saying, well, we want you to give concessions to the pharmaceutical products we manufacture, so we want this to be the manufacturing process that's undertaken in our country. And EU are saying, well, we want you to give preference on motor vehicles, and then the other party says, but we make our own motor vehicles. Why should we reduce duties? So they come to a compromise position. Contentious areas are always textiles, clothing and foodstuffs. And that's where we see a lot of variety sometimes within the agreements. Okay. So we need a plan for using FTAs. So move on, please. You need to understand, as I've said, the amount of duty you're going to save and the tariff number. Now, actually, you only need the first 4 digits. That is called the tariff heading. A lot of rules are related to a whole chapter, which are the first 2 numbers of a commodity code. But you do need to establish the first 4 because there are variants within a chapter. So it is quite technical. If you are a manufacturer in the UK and you import goods from other countries, including other countries in the EU, you have to know where that product was made. And now we're talking about origin, nationality, and whether those goods can be included in any calculation of originating status. I'll touch on that a little bit more with supplier declarations. Then you need the tariff headings of these goods you've bought in, because the rule may be you can say your goods meet the rules of preference if everything you've imported had a different tariff heading than what you've actually made. So as I said, it does mean you have to keep a lot of records here as well. Once we're happy that we've got those pieces of information, we might have to go out to suppliers and say, we bought this from you in Germany, but we need you to confirm that it meets the rules of origin under this trade agreement. That's a supplier declaration, and they can be issued for up to 2 years as a long-term supplier declaration. If you buy in products even from the UK, other EU member countries, you need this to support your use of free trade agreements. Free trade agreements, key articles, generally they have things called indirect transport, so goods must move directly from you to the other party in the free trade agreement. Neutral elements are covered so that you don't have to worry where oil or gas or electricity comes from. And there are other special articles that relate to things like sets, and can we include Turkish origin material, which is cumulation. So do look at the articles as well as the list rules. Okay, thank you. But the list rules is where we get the detail. Okay, they lay out the specific conditions, and as I said, the main thing is get the first 4 digits of your tariff heading. You can't use the FTA if goods fail to meet the originating criteria. So if goods are made in another country, such as China and the US, and you bring them to the UK and repack them, that is a minimal process, and those goods cannot be exported under the free trade agreement because they are not classed to be originating. You've not done enough work. You've not done a significant process. Okay, thank you. Here is an example of the list rule. This is for Chapter 70, and even this is complicated to read. We have a main rule for all goods beginning with 70 as a tariff number, and that appears underneath the commodity code. So manufacture in which all materials used are classified within a heading other than that of the product, number 3 there. We then have an alternative rule, an exception, which is the example number 1. So if the tariff number is 7006, then manufacture must be from non-coated glass plate substrates of heading 7006. That's a specific manufacturing process. Or alternatively, we might have an EX rule, which is an exclusive rule to the description of goods in the second column. And you will notice that that origin rule is different as well. So you really need to find out which rule of origin applies to you. So on the next example, example 2, this is a different chapter, chapter 33, and it gives us origin rule 1 and origin rule 2. Because for a lot of chapters, they actually give you 2 chances to qualify. Origin rule 1 in this instance means that you have to change tariff heading of all the products you import, but it gives you a 20% value concession. Origin rule 2 is purely what's called value added. So you can import materials from around the world, but non-originating materials must not exceed 40% of your selling price. That's what the ex-works price means. So it's your purchase prices versus your selling price. And if you are unable to establish the origin of any material, it becomes non-originating. So you have to hold evidence that the goods actually are of EU origin to include in this free trade agreement. So let's have a look at the change of tariff heading example. So next slide, please. Okay, so here we have wood, Harmonised System tariff code 4407. It's imported from outside the EU and they make it into a chair, 9403. The standard preferential qualification rule is change of tariff heading from the material brought in to the finished product. So as long as that's the rule within the free trade agreement that you're dealing with, you've qualified. It's gone from 4407 to 9403. Change of tariff heading would also qualify if it had gone from 4407 to 4408, because the tariff heading is the 4 digits, okay. But what we have to be certain of, though, is even if there is a tariff change, sometimes called a tariff shift, that we have actually done a process and we haven't just packaged these together or taken 2 bits of wood and knocked them together. We've actually gone through a manufacturing process. Okay, so change of tariff heading, it does actually mean that the numbers change. But you've got to remember the articles and make sure it's not just a minimum process. In the next example, we have a very common rule, which is the added value. Now this requires calculations and you need to have a calculation sheet. So if it says that you are allowed up to 40% non-originating material, we have to know what material is originating, the value of the material that is not originating, add in our labour, overheads and profit costs to create what is termed in the agreements an ex-works price. It's nothing to do with Incoterms and it's nothing to do with how you actually sell goods. They just need the price of goods excluding any packaging or other services. Then you add all that up, and if the non-originating material content is below 40%, you qualify. And you must keep an example of this and a list, because you can be challenged at any time by customs. And very often on exports, it will be your customs authority that will be asking you to prove this. Now you'll notice on this chart there are a few call-off boxes. With materials and components originating, some agreements allow countries other than the EU to supply material, and then it can be called originating. So for example, if we were selling goods to Norway, they would accept in our manufacturing process material from Switzerland and Turkey. But each of those is unique to the free trade agreement. So if you stick to just the main members of the agreement, but doing that you have 44% non-originating, you would then look to see if any other origins would be accepted as originating. The ones that we declare are originating, we need supplier declarations. So we have to make sure that we have that. But we can also get supplier declarations to confirm that the material doesn't originate. Labour, overheads and profits are always originating costs. It doesn't matter where the profit goes, whether it goes to a company in Japan or the US or Switzerland. As long as the manufacturing process takes place within the EU, labour, overheads and profit is originating. So yes, if some of you are thinking, well, I'll just increase my profit then, yeah, you can do. Commercially, it's your customers that will stop you from doing that. But if you genuinely get paid at that price, which is increased, and you don't offer any discounts or rebates, notice that in the box below, so it is a genuine price, then yes, the goods would qualify because you've increased the profit. But remember, it's a lot of work in doing this, and make sure that you've got at the end of that something that one of my bosses used to talk about, the cash bell. Is it actually making sense to do this work to save that amount of money? Okay. Now it's important that you look at supplier declarations. So just before finishing, another word on supplier declarations. So we can move on, please. Okay. These supplier declarations, as a exporter, if you're selling to free trade agreement countries such as Switzerland, Norway, South Korea and the others that I've mentioned, anything you buy from the UK or the EU, if you want to count it in your qualifying material percentage, you need a supplier declaration. That, let me just reiterate, means buying from companies in the UK as well, right? Okay, long-term supplier declarations are permitted within the EU and they can be valid for up to 2 years. Although do be very careful, because you must make sure that they confirm that if they change any processes, they will amend the long-term supplier declaration. You may also be asked for long-term supplier declarations by your customers in the UK and the EU. So as a supplier yourself, your customers may want to use your material to meet qualifying rules under free trade agreements. Be very, very careful issuing these. They have the same legal weight as issuing the preference documents and statements when you export. And although this is a simplification, if your German customer gets challenged, perhaps by Israeli customs, that the free trade agreement declaration was incorrect, if they have a long-term supplier declaration from you, they'll just go to Israeli customs, go to the UK, they confirmed it, and they more or less wash their hands of it. It's a bit more complicated than that, but perhaps you get the idea of how serious this is. You were saying, yeah, we're supplying you these goods and they qualify for every trade agreement that you're going to issue them for. So be very careful issuing them. Okay. So just a final point before the conclusion, how are we going to declare these goods under the FTA? So next slide, please. Well, we can issue the relevant free trade agreement documents at export. For most of the EU free trade agreements, that's an EUR1 form. And I would imagine a lot of you will obtain that via a Chamber of Commerce. Although you can still apply to customs for the forms free of charge, you have to wait, you post it to them, they stamp it and post it back. So chambers tend to have a much faster turnaround, but they charge for that turnaround. That is an official document, and that allows your customer to save money. If the goods are below 6,000 euros, and that's per order, not just per shipment, because some people split orders up, you can make a declaration on your invoice. That declaration must be signed and dated, and it is a legal statement. If it's a higher value than 6,000, then you can become an approved exporter, and you have to apply to UK Customs. And they will ask you to provide evidence that you understand how to operate free trade agreements, that you have all the correct qualifying rules and regulations, and you have the right procedures, processes, and skilled staff. It's not as easy as it used to be to get an approved exporter. There's a lot of checks made. Some country agreements, in particular South Korea, do not allow EUR1 forms. They want everything to be much smoother running, no checking of paperwork. So if you trade with South Korea, you have to become an approved exporter. And on the horizon, we have 2 EU free trade agreements that are in place, but they're not actually operating yet. EU Canada and EU Vietnam, and they're using a new scheme of preferential statements called the Registered Exporter Scheme. But in the UK, you have to be an approved exporter to be added to that REX list. So we're keeping it pretty consistent. Be careful making the declarations, these and the supplier declarations. They are legally binding. And although the money may be saved in your customer's country, you are also responsible for that declaration. So it's a responsibility of both parties, the party that issues it and the party that uses it. Okay, so in conclusion, the last slide. Understand and plan, which means you've got to know your goods and you've got to know the trade agreements that are involved. Now, currently we're part of the EU, so we have lots of trade agreements to have a go at, but they are all slightly different. So you've got to know whether that has an impact on what you're doing. When the UK leaves the EU, we will have a new set of agreements and we may still be able to use the EU, who knows. So all of that really is just to say, get yourself sorted out now. Make sure you've got the correct evidence, make sure that you have the right procedures and that you're issuing the correct statements. And know how much money is being saved. You know, it makes goods cheaper, it makes us more competitive to work with free trade agreements, but actually in a lot of markets goods already have zero duty under most favoured nations, so do your research. Okay, thank you. Okay, back to you then, William.
Thank you, Sandra. That's a heck of a lot of information you've just shared there, so thank you so much, and I hope everyone's found that useful. Just a reminder to everyone that we will be able to share slides afterwards, so if you need us to share slides with you, get in touch with us at admin@opentextport.com. But now to discuss services, we're going to hand over to Gabriel. Over to you.
Hello, hello everyone. And so in my presentation, I'm going to provide an overview of what the services chapters include in most recent free trade agreements and what can they do for those who export services. I will cover 5 main points. I will cover the scope of application of the agreements, both in terms of the service sectors and the modes of supply that are covered, the countries that accord preferential access to British services and service suppliers, the nature of the preferential treatment provided by these agreements, the type of measures that are inconsistent with them, and finally, the remedies available to the exporter when facing inconsistent measures. Next week, please. So the first question is, do I export services? Now, in most cases, this is a pretty obvious Question. However, unlike goods, services are intangible and there are different ways in which services can be traded. Therefore, some people may well export services without realizing that they are doing so. This slide includes some examples of services exports, some of them more obvious than others. For example, a web designer that designs web pages for companies based abroad is exporting services. But also in a hotel that hosts foreign tourists, or a private health clinic based in the UK that offers treatment to foreign patients, or a theatre company that performs abroad. In all these cases, there is an export of services. This may be clearly specified when we look in the next slide to the different modes of supply of services. So can we move to the next one, please? So trading services involves not just the cross-border movement of the service itself, as it would be in the case of good, where the good moves from one country to the other. It may well be accompanied by the cross-border movement of the supplier itself on a temporal or permanent basis, the cross-border movement of the consumer, or the cross-border movement of data, goods, or capital necessary for the supply of the service. As a result, free trade agreements cover 4 different modes of supply. To illustrate this, I take a hypothetical example of an IT firm, Safe Cloud Technologies Limited, based in the UK, and see how there are 4 modes of supply this company can export services. First of all, the cross-border supply of services from the UK into the territory of the other party. In our example, when the company provides a server based in the UK to back up data from companies based abroad. Second, in the UK to the service consumer or the service consumer's property of the other party. In our example, the IT firm receives, repair, and set back hardware from a foreign client. Third, by a UK service supplier through a commercial presence in the territory of the other party. In our example, when our IT firm may open a branch abroad to provide web management services in the importing country. Or finally, when a UK service supplier through the presence of natural persons in the territory of the other party. So in this case, when employees from the IT firm in the UK travel abroad on a temporary basis to set up the network infrastructure for a client, and then they come back. Or, of course, you can do all these for 4 modes of supply. But it's important to know that in trading services is much more complex than trading goods, because it's not only the service that moves, it can only move the consumer, the service supplier as well. Next one, please. So, like Sandra was presenting in goods, the first thing to know is whether or not I am exporting services to a country bound by a free trade agreement with the UK. For the time being, this means asking whether I am exporting services to a country with which the EU has concluded a trade agreement, and that includes a services chapter. You can check this in the WTO website or the European Commission website. Here is a link that you can check later. But for example, countries that have entered into a free trade agreement with the EU that includes concessions on services are the EU-Korea FTA, the CETA agreement, Canada and the EU agreement, the EU and Mexico, EU and Central America, EU-Ukraine, EU-Georgia, and so forth. I would say that the most recent agreements, all of them would have a services chapter. Now, if you export to countries where there is no free trade agreement with the EU in force, then trade relations fall back to WTO rules. This means that UK services and service suppliers are entitled only to the standards of treatment specified in the WTO members' schedules of specific commitments. And again, you can look at what are the schedules in the link provided there. But let's look in greater detail what is this preferential treatment about. So let's move to the next one, please. So it must be remembered that free trade agreements are treaties that impose binding obligations on states, not on private parties. When it comes to services, there are two key binding obligations that bound parties to the agreement. So first of all is the market access commitment and the national treatment commitment. So when a party to a free trade agreement make a specific commitment on market access, it means that that party cannot adopt or maintain measures that impose limitations on the number of service suppliers, the total value of service operations, the quantity of services output, the number of the natural persons that may be employed in a particular services sector, may not restrict the type of legal entity through which a service supplier may supply a service, or it may not impose a cap on foreign ownership of services firms. This is the market access obligation. The other key obligation that a party to an FTA with a service commitment includes is a national treatment obligation. That means that the party is committed to accord foreign services and service suppliers in respect of all measures affecting the supply of services a treatment no less favorable than that it accords to its own like services and service suppliers. Now, this is quite a broad obligation because the meaning of a measure includes any legislation, law, regulation, rule, procedure, ways in which public authorities behave. The supply of services include the production, distribution, marketing, sale, delivery of a service. So any measure that may accord less favorable treatment to the foreign supplier vis-a-vis a like domestic supplier in this respect would be a breach of the national treatment commitment. So two key obligations: not to impose quantitative restrictions and not to discriminate against the foreign service supplier. Next one, please. Now, what exactly is the scope and the extent of these market access and national treatment obligations? Well, the devil is in the detail. It is necessary to go to each free trade agreement and to look at the schedule of specific commitments that each party has annexed to those agreements and see in which sectors and in which modes of supply the parties have made market access and national treatment commitments. So there is no escape but to look at the agreement itself and with the annexes to see which services are covered. And there are two main types of ways in which the parties to an FTA record the market access and national treatment commitments. The positive list approach, in which these market access and national treatment obligations apply only in those sectors and modes of supply included in a party schedule of specific commitments and subject to the limitations and conditions specified therein. For example, the case of the EU-Chile FTA is an example of positive list approach. Or the party would say, well, we commit to grant market access and national treatment to all foreign service suppliers in all sectors and in all modes of supply, except those measures included in a list of reservations of non-conforming nations. This is the case of the CETA agreement between the EU and Canada. So there is a need to look, as I said, to each free trade agreement and read the annexes. The WTO is developing a database which concentrates all FTAs, and all the list of commitments, so it's a quick way to know if in a specific FTA agreement there are commitments that cover my sector and mode of supply. And there is a link there you can check later on. Let's move to this next one, please. So given these two obligations, two main obligations that the FTA, the services chapters of FTAs impose on parties to the agreement, what would be measures that violate these obligations? For example, a quantitative restriction on the number of service suppliers. So say that there is a commitment on hotels and the importing country suddenly introduce a license that caps the numbers of new hotels that can be established in a country based on an economic needs test. And that would be a violation of the market access obligation. Discriminatory measures against the foreign supplier with regard to the production, distribution, marketing, sale and delivery of services. Let's say that a government restricts the amount of advertising time for a foreign services compared to the amount of time allowed at domestic service, or it imposes a tax, a VAT on a premium on foreign insurance company that the rate is higher than the one levied on the domestic insurer. Those are taxation, discriminatory taxation measures. But remember that because the scope of this obligation is any measure that affects its supply, it also would cover measures that may restrict international transfers and the payment of services, any exchange rate regulation, access to foreign exchange to pay for the service could qualify as an inconsistency measure. Measures that restrict the movement of persons that supply or consume the service could also qualify as being inconsistent, or if the capital, the movement of capital is necessary to provide a service, for example in financial services, or if it's necessary to move a good, and there are restrictions on the movement of goods or in the movement of data necessary to provide a service, this could also qualify as a measure inconsistent with the market access or the national treatment obligation. So quite broad. Next one, please. Now, these agreements, the aim of this agreement is not to force parties to harmonize domestic regulations applicable to the supply or the consumption of services. So each party retains its discretion to regulate services as they see fit, according to their own policy choices and values. So if a country A may decide that the requirements to get a license to provide financial services are A, B, and C, whereas country B may decide that the requirements are X, Y, and Z. As long as such requirements are applied in a non-discriminatory way, they will be FTA consistent. So licenses, technical requirements and procedures, qualification requirements and procedures, as long as they do not impose quantitative restrictions and they do not discriminate against foreign service suppliers, they will be WTO consistent. The FTAs do not force a party to recognize a license, a qualification granted by other parties' regulators. This is totally different from what happens between EU member states. Between the EU, a member, for example, a bank that has got a license from the UK Financial Authority becomes a holder of a financial services passport that enables that bank to provide services in any other member state without having to apply for a license in each of the member states it wants to operate. That's not the case of the FTAs. You will still have to get a license if that is what is required to supply the service. The only thing you can ask for is to make sure that that license is not applied in a discriminatory way against yourself. So next one will please. Unlike trade in goods, in trading services, again, there is a possibility for the foreign supplier to move across border, the foreign consumer, and therefore there is much more complex issues that may be related to taxation and the possibility of double taxation. So taxes, when it comes to trade in services, is a particularly sensitive issue that one needs to pay particular attention to. Now, FTA agreements do not necessarily provide a solution to this possibility of double taxation. The only thing that free trade agreements in services can guarantee is to prevent discriminatory taxation. So the importing country cannot apply a VAT higher on foreign supplier than a domestic like service supplier. But the services supplier's trade-generated profit may well be subject to income tax in its country of origin and in the importing country. If so, it is a double taxation agreement rather than free trade agreement that can solve this matter. Taxation systems are usually designed to relieve taxes on exported goods via rebates, drawbacks, etc. This is not always the case for services exports, and you need to double check what is the case in your sector and in the importing country as well. So I would say for this, I've seen in the website of OpenX a nice presentation on VAT applicable to the export of services. That's one whole complex chapter. You can also look into income taxes and how to avoid double taxation. I am not going to cover this in any detail. This is for tax lawyers to deal with. I'm just trying to raise awareness about the importance of taxation when it comes to free trade, to trading services, and the limited solutions that the free trade agreement provide to this. This is more about looking at double taxation agreements. Thank you. Next one, please. So another thing when it comes is, am I or my company entitled to the preferential treatment provided by the FTA? We've heard Sandra discussing very complex rules about how to prove the evidence of a good originating within the territory of the FTA to be entitled to the preferential tariff treatment. In services, rules of origin are much more liberal. And of course, we need to look at the details of each agreement, but subject to minor variations, most FTAs would recognize the following. For natural persons, any citizen or permanent residents in the territory of a party will be entitled to the preferential treatment. And for legal persons, any legal entity duly constituted or otherwise organized under the law of a party that is engaged in substantive business operations in the territory of that party, and that is directly or indirectly owned or controlled by a person of that party, will also be entitled to the preferential treatment. Next one, please. Now, another thing that most recent free trade agreements cover is an investment chapter. So if that is the case, if the agreement has on the one hand a services chapter, a goods chapters, but also an investment chapter, then this investment chapter will cover investments in all services, subject to reservations, but it will also include investment in services sectors. So if you want to supply your service through a permanent commercial presence in the territory of the investment of the importing country, so basically you make a foreign direct investment and set up a company abroad, then this is a chapter you need to look into in order to protect your access and your standards of treatment abroad. Because the obligations imposed on this chapter are much more ambitious than the ones on the services chapter. They provide far more extensive standards of protection by imposing obligations on national treatment, most favored nation, fair and equitable treatment, full protection of security, minimum standards for expropriation, commitment not to restrict transfers of funds, commitment not to impose performance requirements. All these are obligations that the host country must abide by with respect to foreign service suppliers that establish a commercial presence in the territory. And next one, please, the final. So what happens if something goes wrong? At the end of the day, what is the remedy available if the importing country violates its obligations of market access and national treatment and, for example, restrict the access of a foreign service supplier or impose discriminatory conditions to get a license to supply a particular service? Well, the solution is a state-to-state dispute settlement system to deal with breaches of services obligations. So a company or a natural person affected by measures adopted by the importing country must request their country to bring a dispute against the other party. They cannot sue directly the host country to challenge that discriminatory measure or that quantitative restriction. In the case of the UK, and for the time being, you need to go to the European Commission and request an investigation and ask them to bring a case against the importing country under the rules of dispute settlement rules of the FTA. Now, the Commission has set a formal procedure by which any company or individual that is affected by a measure adopted by the importing country can report that and trigger or apply to trigger a dispute settlement system. And there's a link there where you can click, and if you feel that your services are affected in some way inconsistent with the obligations of a free trade agreement, you can put forward your complaint there, and it will be for the Commission to decide whether there is strong evidence to bring a case or not. But at the end of the day, it's a state-to-state dispute settlement system. The only exception to this would be the investment chapter. If you have an investment chapter, these chapters provide for a dispute settlement system which allows the foreign investor to sue the host state before an international arbitration tribunal. So if you are exporting, if you have made a foreign direct investment in services in Canada, and you don't need to go to the European Commission and ask the Commission to bring a case against Canada. Under the investment chapter, you can bring an investment claim against the Canadian government. So that's the final comment with respect to the remedies provided by this agreement. And therefore, to conclude, there are three key takeaways for this presentation. First of all, free trade agreements in services are treaties, and as such they impose obligations on states. The key obligations when it comes to services is not to restrict the quantity of foreign services and service suppliers and not to discriminate against them. The details have to be identified by reading the schedules of specific commitments annexed to each FTA. And finally, the remedy for a breach of these obligations relies on a state-to-state dispute settlement mechanisms. Affected companies must request the government to bring a case against the importing country, unless there is an investment chapter that allows the company to sue directly the host state before an international investment tribunal. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Again, lots of information, and it's obviously such a big topic. So yeah, I hope everyone's found that useful. We're going to have a slightly shorter question session today, just because we've obviously, it's been quite a lot of information just then. We've had quite a lot of very detailed kind of questions about kind of specific codes. With those, I recommend kind of looking at the Institute of Export website and the technical helpline service they provide, because we won't be able to go into detailed questions right now. But we will ask a couple of quick, more general questions. So one question is from Sebastian, and I think this might be for you, Sandra, and just kind of, will the market access database still be relevant for UK businesses when the UK leaves the EU? So over to you, Sandra.
What a great question. We may not have access to it. The regulations will start off pretty much the same because of the Great Repeal Bill. That's our expectation. But the way that the UK will be treated by overseas markets is even more debatable than how we'll be treated by the EU as a third country. The market access database will remain relevant for us as long as we're members of the EU and if we're exporting out of the EU. But other than that, it's part of the negotiations and just really can't comment.
Fair enough. I'm sure that'll be a theme for many sorts of questions we could put across today. The next question is from Susan, and it's probably for Gabriel, and it's about IP, and it's just a question: is IP affected by FTAs as well?
Yes, absolutely. FTAs do have an IP chapter, which again stipulate the minimum standards of intellectual property protection that parties to this agreement must grant to goods and services from originating in the territory. So yes, the FTAs do cover intellectual property, and they do so in a more ambitious way than WTO standards.
Thank you. And as we're very short on time, I'm just going to do one last question, which I guess maybe hits the nail on the head a little bit. It's from Richard, and the question is, why is it considered so bad to have to revert to WTO rules in international trade? Obviously, a lot's been spoken about this, but Sandra, if you want to give a quick kind of answer to summarize today's discussion.
Okay, well, WTO rules are the standard rules of trade. Looking at the WTO members, as we did a few months ago, I can see no country that just works on WTO rules. They all have agreements in one field or another with other countries. If we take, for example, the pharmaceutical industry as just one random example, lots of certificates are required to prove that pharmaceutical products meet the requirements of that particular Ministry of Health to be sold in that market. Now, the EU have a lot of mutual recognition agreements. The systems we have, the good manufacturing practices certificates, the statements we can make within the UK are on EU health certificates. They're currently accepted in nearly every country in the world. Not all of them, but the EU's just sorting that out with America. So if we're not covered by these individual agreements, we will be trading in a similar way to markets that are not members of the WTO, really, which means that we'll have the higher duty rates, so our products will be incurring a higher cost, but it will be the paperwork because we will not be recognised as an exporter. Our history as being an exporter from the UK alone vanished in 1993 when we became part of the internal market and the single market. So actually the UK has no individual reputation globally. So when they talk about going back to WTO rules, they're talking about us starting from scratch, not just on the money side, but with all the agreements. And is it bad news? Well, it's hard work, I'll put it like that. But trade doesn't die, and people will negotiate and things will be put in place. But it's much better if we can, first of all, set up an agreement with the 27 member states of the EU, and then we can approach the other countries and say, this is our agreement here, so can we have this agreement with you? And each different product area will have to be considered separately, as will services and other things.
Gabriel, do you have anything to quickly add to that?
Yes, free trade agreements are by definition WTO plus, so they grant more preferential treatment to goods and services than the standards of treatment committed by members under the WTO. So the conditions of access for your goods and for your service under a free trade agreement will be more beneficial than the ones you get under WTO rules. In the case of services, it may well be that countries agreed on a better access to engineering services, whereas the schedules of commitment under WTO don't even mention that. That's one example. Yeah, so better access for goods and services under FTAs and under WTO.
Thank you both. And on that note, we're slightly running over, so thank you once again to Sandra and Gabriel. Some fantastic information there and some great answers at the end too. So I hope everyone's found that useful. Just a reminder that the Institute of Export does have a technical helpline which you can use if you're a member to get kind of more specific questions answered, and we also have the Open to Export Ask the Experts forum as well. Before heading off, I'd like to draw your attention to upcoming events being run by the Institute of Export and International Trade, especially the Managing Risks and Opportunities in Emerging Markets course in London on May 25th. As we can tell, selling into new markets beyond the EU is going to be important for UK businesses following Brexit. Brooke Horowitz from IBLF Global will be giving practical advice and instructions on how to make the most of these opportunities without falling victim to some of the political and business risks that are out there. You can find out more about this on www.export.org.uk. We're actually running an Open to Export webinar introducing this topic with Brooke on May 9th, which you can sign up to now. Our next webinar, though, is on May 4th, which is on treating exporting as a professional skill and why it matters to do so. And obviously, today's webinar will have given some ideas as to why that is important. This webinar will see our CEO, Leslie Batcher, and 2 international trade graduates discuss their careers in trade, while giving an insight into how taking the time to specialise in exporting can be a great long-term and short-term investment for any business. That's all from us for now. Please take our survey at your exit to let us know what you thought of the webinar and to give any suggestions for improvements or future topics. For now, though, goodbye.